Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to the Sounds podcast. And today's special guest is Juliana Kaplan, a senior labor and inequality reporter at Business Insider, who has been at the forefront of examining the shifting dynamics of the American economy. Her latest piece, The American Dream is Shrinking, explores how the quintessential vision of success in America, home ownership, family stability, and upward mobility, is becoming increasingly unattainable for many. Through insightful analysis and compelling data, Juliana sheds light on how rising costs, shrinking homes, longer commutes, and dwindling life satisfaction are reshaping the American dream for today's generation. I should also mention that Juliana graduated from Bernard College of Columbia University, and she majored in English with concentration in creative writing. Juliana, thank you so much for joining us today on Sounds.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Shout out to all of my fellow English majors with a job. We did it.
Well, it's funny because I myself was an English major. And so I find that kind of interesting, and I want to kind of get into that maybe. I know when I was growing up and studying English and eventually teaching English, I had to read a lot of books and plays dealing with the theme of the American dream. Things like Death of a
Mm,
Salesman, of Mice and Men. It's kind of one of the areas that you really get into it as an English major. I don't know if that was the case with you, but I was sort of wondering how your English background maybe has influenced your writing that you're doing now about more um, particular items that are actually happening in real life today in your realistic journalism.
yeah. I love that question. Whenever asked about being an English major, definitely we had a lot of the classic American Dream curriculum, the Gatsby, Death of a Salesman, of it all. But as you noted, I went to Barnard, which is a women's college, and so I think just intrinsically based on that and a historical focus on marginalized folks in America, it was something that was really integrated into a lot of the work I did. I took a great class in college that I reference all the time called American Diva, Race, Gender, and Performance, all about the different divas who define America. Absolutely amazing. I did a project on Judy Garland, but all this to say, I a lot of my a lot of my coursework at Barnard and in the English major, we focused a lot on what wasn't accessible to people, and especially women, especially folks of color, especially queer folks, or the ways that those dreams were sort of diminished or made scrapped. I actually wrote my English thesis on Virginia Woolf, who we love, and the idea of the female flaneur. For those who are not familiar, flaneur is especially in like older writing of that era writing, narrator who sort of walks around the city, walks around urban spaces, is very focused on the act of walking and sort of becoming narrative, but also narrating it themselves. And my thesis was about how Virginia Woolf's work is all about how the female flaneur can never exist. Like the idea of the flaneur is the subjective narrator who can go around and access these spaces, but that's only a man, right? Like that's
Mm.
not something that was accessible to women of that era. And that's why, call for a room of one's own is so radical. And Mrs. Dalloway getting her own flowers. These are all things that intrinsically show that when you make this assumption of somebody can be an objective narrator, what does that mean to have that objectivity? And how Virginia Woolf's writing was always craving the idea of a woman being able to be a flaneur in the same way, but because of gendered norms and the way that gender works in society, that objectivity is only accessible to a very slim group of people. And I think that obviously carries into what I'm writing here too. To me, I see fairly obvious connections. Um, when I was thinking a lot about this article and a lot of my work, I approach it from a generational perspective and not in a like millennials killed everything way or Gen Z is killing this or whatever. But I feel like I'm very interested in sort of the diminishing returns. Like for Virginia Woolf, what is the reduced way that she's able to be a flaneur? And then in a very practical way, I'm sure we all have this experience. Like you go into the grocery store to buy toilet paper
Mm,
and it's so much smaller. I've
yeah,
been thinking about this a lot where you go to pick up something and expect it to have this test, right? And what are all of the intangible forces that have made that so much smaller in your hand? And it sounds like a very like small, silly thing, but it is something that I hope everyone is using.
yeah,
To be clear, everyone should be using. Um,
yeah.
but the ways that these forces are shaping our lived experiences and our lived realities. And thinking too about the American dream, obviously, as you noted, I do a lot on data and economic data and the ways that different groups are historically behind and marginalized. And something that we have actually seen over the last few years is that wage gaps still exist, but they are closing a little. There is more economic opportunity and equity for queer people, for people of color. But when you arrive at the American dream, it's like that shrunken piece of toilet paper, right?
Mm.
Like you're expected to be satisfied with these diminished returns. So that was a very long-winded way of explaining how I see that English major sort of playing into the real life work I'm doing.
Well, thank you for explaining that. And I think one of the reasons this article is going to really hit home for a lot of people across all political spectrums is that while it's definitely true that for many, many years there were various groups of people, many of who you mentioned, who were left out of the American dream. But I think today, a lot of people, maybe most people, are feeling that the American dream is unattainable. And you get into very specific examples in this article of why that may be. Maybe one of the first things we can kind of just review for people who have not read your article, which I highly recommend, is to kind of just summarize what is like the stereotypical American dream? What are the characteristics of that classic American dream that some people think of?
Yeah, you sound like my editor when I did this idea. They were like, let's get a little specific. But, basically a home that's a reasonable size that you own, um, the ability to have children if that's something you wish to do, uh, lucrative career, uh, a commute that is easy and doable. I think this is an underrated one, but I'm glad that we called it out in the article.
I agree.
And then the the ability to, take a vacation or have time off. Um, and, I think also the idea of just being able to feel satisfied in all of those things. So, yeah, at its core, it's housing, ability to own, reasonable size, ability to have children if you wish to, easy commute, ability to take vacation. And obviously, all of that is layered on top of being able to afford like basic expenses and necessities.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things. All the things that you mentioned seem to be going in the opposite direction now than what people used
Indeed.
to either have or want. Let's go through a few of them. Home ownership. What have you discovered about home ownership that fascinated you?
Yeah, there's a few things happening. One is that first time homeowners are getting just a lot older, and I think that is very telling of a trend.
Mm,
So in the article, for instance, I called out in 1981, the median age of a first time home buyer was 29. I'm 27, so this was inconceivable to me. And in 2024, which obviously is the year that we have most recent data for, that age went up to 38. That's, you know,
Wow.
9 years later in life. And that to me was really stark. Um, and, that's not to say like in a vacuum, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. Like maybe people have more flexibility or they want to move around more, but looking in that in the context of rent is so much more expensive and apartments are shrinking. And at the same time, when you are finally able to get to that stage of home ownership, houses are shrinking, which, as I said in the article, again, not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I'm sure we've all heard about McMansions and the scourge of houses that are too big in inhibiting walkable communities, but those houses that are getting smaller are also getting more expensive.
Yeah.
So you're paying more for less at a later age in life after spending all this money on rent. So putting all those pieces together, not a very rosy picture, you know?
It's funny. My sense from reading your article is that there are a lot of people that still do want the house, that still do want to
Yeah.
take a vacation, that if they could, would have a family if they want it. Um, and yet, there's been so many messages in the media in recent years, almost trying. I don't know if it's that leaders have just sensed that this is going to become increasingly more difficult, and they're just trying to like prepare people for changes, or if it's just a different way of thinking that some people subscribe to. But it seems like people have been getting hit with this message of like maybe it's wrong to consume too much, to want a house, to want certain things in life. It's not good for society. It's not really the
Mm-hmm.
focus of this article, but I'm sure you're familiar with these kinds of ideas. Do you think that there has been a big push to try and get people to change their vision of the dream because it is just going to become more difficult, or that it's not really good for the planet, or whatever it is that is causing some people to promote this message?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it's very American to shift these larger systemic questions into individual burden. Um, I think climate change, for instance, is a great example of this, um, in terms of like what people as individuals should be doing versus what systems should be doing. But yeah, I think when I was approaching this article, sort of the working headline I had in my head was like the shrinkflation
Mm,
of the American dream, going back to that toilet paper roll, where it's not so much necessarily like teeing people up for a shrunken American dream, but just sort of quietly shrinking it.
yeah,
Like you go to buy the house and the house is a bit smaller, but you don't really have any other uh, options. My cat was really upset about that. Don't know if you heard that, but that, well, you have to buy toilet paper if you want to buy a house. Like this is your chance to buy it. So I do think that is sort of a subliminal forcing people to buy in because you just don't really have another option. And then, you
yeah.
know, you
There's
look
that.
at the real estate portfolios of massively wealthy people. I love watching all of the real estate shows where they're selling the like multi-million dollar apartments and houses. I was just watching a new one about New York where I live, and half of the time the people buying these houses aren't even going to live there. And I'm watching it from my tiny like fourth floor walk up. And I'm like, huh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, there's
Yeah.
been a big
I
push.
hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does, and it just seems like to kind of go along with that. There's been a big push for maybe it's going to be better if you own nothing and you're just happy. It's better to rent than to own. But I think your article is accurate in that even when people, maybe when they're younger, are content with that. Somehow, when they get to that age of 30 something, I don't know what clicks, but then even those people that were maybe happier, just renting and enjoying life and working on their careers or whatever, that's when people start longing for some of those traditional things that people in America have wanted for a long time: the house, the yard, the family, in some cases, the vacation, and it's becoming increasingly difficult. Um, what do you find? You mentioned the
Hmm.
commute. Um, One of the things that's mentioned in your article that sometimes people have to do just in order to maybe make it possible for them to get the house is that they may have to move really far away from where they actually work. For example, I'm here on Long
Hmm.
Island, so it's not uncommon that people might live an hour outside of New York City and commute to the city or something like that, um, in order for them to be able to, afford to get a house. Even that's becoming difficult now. That's becoming out of reach for a lot of people. But but with that comes commuting, and that can really, as you explained in your article, start to wear on people and sort of wear down their quality of life. Can you explain what you found out in your research there?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this is something I think about a lot personally too, because pre-pandemic, where I could afford to live in New York City, was a pretty far commute from my office, and being able to save up during the pandemic and grow, get promoted, and have a higher income. And now I'm like 20 or so minutes from my office, and this is very personal. I has drastically improved my mental health and just like the feeling that I have over the ownership of my time. So I was thinking about this a lot and I wanted to dig into the numbers. But basically, let's go back to the 90s, right? The average travel time to work was 22.4 minutes, um, which, it's a decent amount, but certainly not bad. I'm sure many people listening will be like, that sounds great. And then by 2023, the last year that I found data for, it rose to 26.8 minutes.
Mm,
Again, this is average. That doesn't sound like a huge amount, but it really adds up. Like, I was working out the math on this with my little calculator, and that adds up to nearly 4.5 hours a week extra commuting to work. Or that's 4.5 hours a week just commuting to work, which is 10 days out of your whole year if you're going in every single day.
wow.
And then compared to the 90s, you were spending about 3.7 hours a week commuting, which is around 44 minutes less a week. And I think the comparison I used in my article was that's a whole episode of Real Housewives. But, you know,
Yeah.
you could do many things with that time. But to that point, like, there has been some pretty good research showing that the longer your commute gets, like, the worse you feel about your job and your leisure time because you feel pressed on both. Um, and that also because America has become so car centric, especially to your point with people commuting in from Long Island, although maybe not as much of the congestion pricing, but in the vast majority of the country, people are commuting by car, and that can also impact your mental health and how well you're sleeping, the ways that you have to get into the office. So it's sort of this double-edged sword, right? Where it's like, okay, you found a house that is the right size that you can afford, and it's all the way out in like the deep suburbs. One of my colleagues, Eliza Relman, wrote a really great article about how millennials have been moving to the suburbs and just absolutely hate it. Like out in the deep suburbs, but it's all that they can afford.
Right.
And
And
it's
and why
basically like, okay, you can either choose. Sorry, go ahead.
and why does he hate it?
Because they want to be able to commute into work. They want to be able to walk around. They want to be able to have like, that little city. They
Right.
want to be able to have that community.
Mm.
And then coffee shops, that's the other thing too, right? And I don't think I necessarily touched on this in the article, but what I was thinking about a lot is when you're spending all of your time commuting, like how do you build community in either space, right? And I think that's something that is really important to younger generations, especially in the wake of the pandemic, who haven't had the same opportunities to build these community networks
Mm.
as perhaps older generations. Um, how do you engage with like your local community if you're driving 30 to 40 minutes out of it every single day and then 30, 40 minutes back in? How do you create, the network of neighbors who maybe you trade off doing childcare or like run errands for each other? And if you think about older visions of suburbia, I think you think of the cul-de-sac and all the kids playing together.
Yeah.
And that's not really necessarily the case anymore, which is another reason I think why it's been a difficult adjustment for millennials.
I think there's a lot of things going on. I was speaking to the director of the film Join or Die, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's all about how people are just not joining groups. Kids are not playing together. People are
Yeah,
dropping out of everything. And I think there's just
yeah,
something much bigger going on. It's not just that people. I think you're correct about the commuting, but there's many, many factors that are just making people isolated and not even desiring to be with others. Um, and I'm not sure what that is, but there's so many things when you bring up this idea that people aren't having kids and they're not having homes and they're commuting all by themselves, and then even if they do have the possibility to get together with others, they're choosing not to altogether. That it's a pretty dark vision. Um,
yeah,
where do you think this is
yeah.
going? Where do you think this is going?
I mean, it reminds me, I actually wrote an article last year about how America is having what I called a fringe friend crisis, which is
Mm,
sort of how the conditions of the pandemic and the way that socializing became so segmented
mm-hmm.
sort of robbed us of the ability to make these larger friendship networks. I was thinking specifically about, the person who you always see at a party and you're always happy to see them at a party, but you don't necessarily see one another outside of that. Or like your local bodega guy, the same people who ride the subway with you all of the time. And how, and this, to answer your question, I spoke to a lot of younger people for that article who were saying, I'm lonely, I'm trying really hard to make friends. And there is this real movement on that part. And in sort of the social sphere of young people very intentionally trying to create community. Like, I don't know if you've been following this, but the rise in speed dating and
Mm.
in-person speed dating
Yeah.
or meetup or all these other different types of groups. So that I think is a bright spot in all of this. But in terms of where all of this is going in terms of the shrinking of the American dream, I mean, ugh, gosh, it's not looking great.
Yeah.
You know, I I don't know. I think that unfortunately, I think without some sort of intervention, things will just get more and more squeezed and
Yeah.
will get smaller and smaller. And I think people are already starting to chafe at that, and it's just going to get more and more constricted. The word that kept coming up for me when I was talking to people about this is this bifurcation, which is not to say that the American dream will go away for everybody, but it will become increasingly, you know, segmented, and a smaller and smaller share of people will have access to it. It used to be you didn't necessarily have to have a college degree. You could get like a good union or factory job,
Yep.
be able to work your way into this American dream. And then it was like, okay, well, now you have to go to college to do that. And now you can go to college and still not have it. So it's just going to become a smaller and smaller segment of the population if it continues on this trajectory. As I said, as a 27-year-old, I would hope it does not, but I don't know if I can bring any good news or prediction.
Well, I don't know how familiar you are with this radio show, but I do talk to people on both the left and the right, and I really try to do that, and I've always done that. And certainly, I'm too concerned about people becoming more in their own little political circles. But
Mm-hmm.
it used to be like, I used to be a big fan of Michael Moore's documentaries, like Roger and Me. And, there was a period where progressives were very much about making sure that jobs stayed here in America. I mean, that whole first film that made him
Mm-hmm.
famous was all about, the auto factories moving out of the country and
Mm-hmm.
and the cost that it had for American workers. And it was
Mm-hmm.
really a progressive argument um, that there should be care placed first on American workers before corporations. And it seems
Yeah.
and I'm not placing blame, but it just seems like that idea now has been adopted by President Trump, and obviously that whole "Make America Great" movement. And I'm sure, as a Business Insider writer, not necessarily a big fan of Trump, but the ideas are just ideas. Americans, I think, want jobs. They want to have the things that we discussed earlier, and I don't know if it's possible from your point of view for people of all different backgrounds to come to some kind of agreement. But different political parties have had the same ideas at different points, and it seems to bounce back and forth between the parties. But I think there's a growing audience
Mm-hmm.
of people that are just all saying, if you work hard and you do the right thing, certain things should become more attainable. And it just seems like the opposite is happening. And I just can't see why.
Yeah.
I can't see why people can't come together on that.
You that is a very good question. I do agree with you, and I think that this, as a larger issue, I don't know if it's like transcends parties is the right way to put it, but I think that a lot of people who identify with different types of political ideologies or party affiliations do feel this way and feel similarly. And this is something that applies to a really big share of people. So I don't know. I do agree that I think that there is across just a wide swath of America a good amount of agreement that this is an issue and something that should be addressed. I do, in covering legislative proceedings, it is always very interesting to see how bills will just go back and forth, and always having these very slim majorities and one party just choosing not to engage with something based purely on a partisan basis, which I think we see fairly frequently, has led to, I think, perhaps maybe some of that feeling of inaction. So I don't really,
Yeah.
I'm not a political commentator. I don't really know how you solve that, but just in covering like economic packages, for instance, like thinking about the big 2021 American Rescue Plan stimulus package, which expanded the enhanced unemployment benefits, gave out stimulus checks, which was something that happened under the previous Trump administration as well,
Hmm.
and provided all this relief to, local areas, and still had to be passed via this reconciliation process, even though many Republicans have said that it's something that benefited their areas. And, we see, obviously not as much in recent history because we've been in a Democratic administration, but similar things happening with the Democrats as well. So, I mean, I think that's always a factor as well.
Yeah. Um, you come from an English background, but you are writing about things that involve economics. And I can't speak for you. I am kind of curious, though, what your thoughts are now. I know for myself, like I'm just always learning, and I can go back and look at some things that I used to think are needed or were needed. And then as time goes on and I learn a little bit more, I start to wonder whether maybe there were some things that came about as a result of that policy that were not so good. I'll give you one example that just confuses me. I support the idea of people being able to go to college, but the more and more I
Hmm.
look at some of the effects of like guaranteed student loans, um, I think that's a great concept in theory. But I've also just learned so much that if it's just this blanket thing where you're guaranteed money, it contributes greatly to the cost of college going up because there's virtually no
Uh-huh.
limit. It's just like free money to colleges. They can just basically keep on raising their costs and building more things, and the people just have to deal with it, and they can deal with it because you're just guaranteed a loan. And and I'm not saying that it would be better without loans, um, but it just becomes this thing where the prices go up and up and up, and I don't know what a better solution would be. I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm wondering, like, have you started to evaluate it all yourself personally about the effects that certain policies have? A lot of times, there's policies with very good intentions, like guaranteeing certain things for people, but then as a result, you could even look at the housing situation. Um, when the interest rates were super low, which is, a great thing if you're at that point when you're trying to buy a house. Um, it's a good thing to be able to get money for your dream at such a low cost. But then usually what happens is the homeowners, as a result, they just start jacking up their prices because now people have access to more money. And then it just, well, it somehow just starts escalating. And then all of a sudden, even though there's low rates, the houses are still unaffordable. So those are just
Hmm.
two examples, and I'm not even saying my interpretation of what's going on is exactly right. But do you have any thoughts about that? About how sometimes policies maybe don't always set out to do what their original intent was?
I do, and I have written about this actually. I think something that is very interesting and that we're still seeing the like headwinds of is this realization by Americans that if the government wanted to, they could just give them money. And
Mm,
I'm referencing, it heavily covered the enhanced unemployment benefits and the impact that those had on people, and also interviewed a lot of people who got the expanded child tax credit as checks. And, I've written about this, how there was this brief moment in our not so distant history and very recent history where Americans realized that, and, you know, not all of those were bipartisan, but there was a good amount of bipartisanship in those. Um, and I think that that's something that we're still dealing with when we think about how people are viewing the economy and viewing politics, because they are now viewing it forever through the lens of if the government chose to do so and wanted to and had the will to do so, they could provide
mm,
them money. I spoke to a lot of people. I did a lot of coverage of the enhanced unemployment benefits where people were saying that, it wasn't that it was disincentivizing them to work, but a lot of people, because of the way that those benefits were expanded, worked in industries with unreliable pay, right? Like
Yeah.
people in food service or gig workers were newly included under that. And it was the first time in their lives that they had like a steady, reliable income. And it drastically changed their mental health, their economic situations. I remember I did a feature a few years ago about people who use that money to go back to school or like start their own businesses or do this thing that they'd always dreamed of doing now that they actually had this reliable income that they had envisioned so many years ago. And then I think similarly, it was gone in a flash.
Yeah.
So I do think about that a lot.
Yeah. It's funny. I know a lot of people too that experience that, and uh, it was very good for them briefly. Um, what do you think of when people have a little taste of that, or if someone is getting really good benefits if they're not working, but the cost of them going and taking a job, I mean, I'm sure you know the math here. A lot of times it just doesn't pay for people to work. The salaries are so low, and if they weren't working, between the health benefits and maybe the food program that they had and other kinds of assistance, it all adds up to, and it's certainly not enough to have the life where you can have all these things that we were talking about earlier in the American dream. So that's frustrating. But then to maybe start that entry level job, or even a mid level job, one doesn't even make that much more necessarily, but you have to work and you have to commute and all that. And I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, in speaking with a lot of people who are in that position, people would much rather work. I think that there's also been some really good research. Erin Dubé, who's an amazing economist, has been really at the forefront of the research on the way that these benefits impacted people's employment and willingness to work, which was it didn't in a substantial way. I'm sure there are people who were, happy to not work. Obviously, I think I once had an economist say to me, in an economy this big, pretty much every story that can be true is true. Um, but I mean, I thought about this a lot in relation to the Great Resignation trend,
Yeah.
which is that if anything, it's more of an indictment of the job than the benefits themselves.
Yeah.
Like people do wish to work, and we see that. Like people, the unemployment rate has been near historic lows. Like people do want to work and enjoy the meaning from that, but it is more, I think, a reflection of the job that the job is
Yeah.
paying less than a government benefit.
I agree. I think in a lot of people's minds, from people I've spoken to and things I've read, people do want to work, and like it if they get the right job, um, but feel that if they're working, they should be well compensated beyond someone who is not. There should be some kind of pay or some kind of reward, or that if you are putting in all that effort and time and dedicating your life to it, then maybe the American dream is attainable. But as your article states, it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to get the house and the fence and the cars and the vacation and all that stuff, and it's becoming more and more difficult. So we could go on and on. I really enjoy speaking with you, and you have a lot of very interesting insights. Can you tell our listeners where they can find your writing?
Oh, yes, you can find my writing on businessinsider.com. And I have been trying to post more on Blue Sky. So my handle. Okay, yes, it's just Juliana Kaplan at Juliana Kaplan on Blue Sky. You can join my um, whopping 697 followers. I've been trying to, figure out where I want to be posting articles. I have been sort of recreationally off Twitter for a few years now, but I do like posting my articles and hearing what people have to say. And I've been really enjoying posting on LinkedIn, actually. So you can come find me on LinkedIn. There's always a lot of interesting people in the comments.
You originally started off studying creative writing. Is that something maybe that you
Yeah.
ever want to get back to?
Um, you sound like my parents. Yeah, definitely. I try to still do it in my free time and also am a huge enjoyer, voracious reader. So I am trying to, especially in this new year, scratch that itch a little bit more, but I also really enjoy the writing that I do now. And, in a fun work related twist, it turns out your job is writing.
Yeah.
If you want to then do writing recreationally, it can feel like work. So if anyone has any tips on that, let me know.
And one last question before I let you go. We talked earlier about some famous books that deal with this idea of the American dream. I talk to a lot of filmmakers typically. Um, I don't know if you're a movie fan or not, but do you have any movie um, that you particularly like that you feel resonates with some of the stuff that you've been writing about in terms of the loss of the American dream?
Oh my gosh, great question. I have been putting my AMC A list to the test. I actually saw Conclave like 4 times because I think it is so good. So just a Conclave plug. Um, you know, genuinely, I just saw Nosferatu, which I think has a lot of very interesting takes on um, both class and desire and ability to have desire and exist fully as a woman. But I'm
That's,
trying to think
that's interesting.
other
I just saw
movies.
that. I see what you're
Oh my
saying.
gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved it too. I thought it was really, really fun.
Y-
Uh, Gosh, what else? My mind is going blank. I recently rewatched A Bug's Life. If anyone has ever seen that one,
Yeah,
which is, yeah,
that's
I was
funny.
like, oh wow, this is a weirdly radical movie. Oh my gosh, I'm going to open my letterbox. Okay, I actually think it's a great movie. This is a hot take that I consistently have that speaks to ideas of work and class and the failing of the American dream is Magic Mike XXL.
Oh yeah.
I this is my hot take. I could talk about that movie forever, but it is very much about what happens after you achieve the American dream and the difficulties of that, and sort of also the associations between ballroom culture and being able to perform this idea of corporate success, which obviously also goes back to Paris's Burning, which is a great film
Hmm.
as well. Um, I was just talking to my sister about the movie Newsies, which is about early labor unions. And oh my gosh, gotta look at
Well, those are definitely some good ones,
line
and I could see why you would choose those. Juliana, it's really been a pleasure speaking with you. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and I want to direct everyone over to the Business Insider, where you write regularly, and also the other places that you mentioned. And hopefully, we can talk again in the future.
Yeah, I would love to. So next time I will come with some more movie recommendations.
That sounds great. Juliana, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our discussion.
All right, thanks. Have a good one.
You too. Bye bye.